Good morning, whānau. Welcome to those who are here with us in the audience here in Wellington, and to those who I understand can now hear us online to this event on the LA fires and ICNZ can be for New Zealand. I'm Chris Farfoy and I'm the Chief Executive of the Insurance Council. And this morning we're co-hosting this event with Tonkin and Taylor. And we'd like to thank James Russell and John Ricks from Tonkin and Taylor for helping to organise this morning's event. Unfortunately, James can't be with us today, so hopefully he's online because there's a sick child to tend to at home, so hoping best for you, James. I can also acknowledge the ICNZ team who've helped pull the event together this morning. I'll get through some of the housekeeping. Our bathroom, if you look at the door you came in, to the left and to the right, and follow the signs. In the event of a fire, you will hear an alarm, and we'll just make our way in an orderly fashion to an area that is just behind me to our left, which is the staging area. Also for an earthquake. Ahead of neighbour here as well, so drop, cover, hold, and we'll make our way out to the assembly area as well. So on to today's forum. Earlier this year in January, a devastating wildfire swept through LA and burning tens of thousands of hectares and destroying more than 15,000 homes and businesses. And with only a quarter of those losses expected to be insured, the events highlight the growing pressure that climate-driven risks place on communities and the insurance industry. Today, we are joined by Dr. Laurie Johnson, Principal and Founder of Laurie Johnson Consulting. Laurie is an award-winning urban planner. Cool. Laurie is an award-winning urban planner with more than 35 years of experience in the intersection of earth science, urban planning, and public policy. She's internationally recognised for her expertise in disaster recovery and disaster risk management, and has advised communities, insurers, governments, including in New Zealand, on how to best prepare for and recover from natural hazards. Her work is captured in her widely cited book, titled After Great Disasters, an in-depth analysis of how 6 countries managed community recovery, which includes lessons drawn from her years of recovery, research and advisory roles in New Zealand following pandemic earthquakes. She is an advisor to Tonkin and Taylor and supporting their work in disaster resilience and recovery within the insurance sector. Laurie will start the session off and share insights from the LA wildfires and what they mean for resilience, recovery and risk management around the world. And we'll then hear from an expert panel, Emily Davis from Tower and Dr. Joe Horrocks from the Natural Hazards Commission, alongside Laurie, which I will moderate. This is intended to be an interactive session, so please feel free to be part of the discussion and put the questions to our panellists towards the latter half of the session. We'll aim to wrap it up at about an hour's time and give your day back to you as well. We do have tea and coffee and breakfast at the back. I'm a Pacific Islander, so I've vacated, so please make sure you help yourself. So thank you all for being here this morning. Laurie, can I hand it over to you?
Thank you so much, Chris and Lorena. Good morning and nice to be here today. And welcome to everybody online. I will go ahead and get going. So I'm going to present the California story. But I don't want you to immediately say, well, you don't have wildfires in New Zealand. I want you to think about this in the context of floods in particular, because it's a covered peril in your standard homeowners insurance policy. And that's really the key point I want to talk about is what's happening to the homeowners insurance market in California. In this case, fire is one of our covered perils. Flood is not, actually. We can talk about that later. So I will talk about the California insurance market, then I will talk about the January 2025 fires. I'll talk about sort of considerations as we move through recovery, both for the insurance industry and for communities, and then talk about what that might mean for New Zealand. So to start, I'm going to take you back to 1988, if anybody was around then. So some really bad hairdos back then, so as to remember those days. The guy on the left is a man named Ralph Nader, which he became quite famous. He's a consumer advocate. He was very successful in a number of things. One of which, there was a lot of legislation passed by the people, something we can do in California. We can actually put propositions on the ballot and vote on them as voters and change our constitution and do all this outside our legislator or our governor. So there was a proposition on the ballot that was largely driven by the high rates of increase in automobile insurance, but it swept in property insurance and life insurance as well. So it was a broad reform, and it was barely passed by the voters. But the implications have been 50 years on immense. So what it did was it changed the structure. We have a very highly regulated market in America. So every state has an agency that will review the rate increases and the policy forms, and the language in the policy forms are quite standardized across companies. And what it did was change the head of that agency, the insurance commissioner, to be an elected position. It used to be appointed by the governor. So it made it a more political position, which had some implications. It rolled back rates across all of these different sectors of insurance by 20%. It required the Department of Insurance to actually review rates. And it said, really driven by automobiles, that you couldn't be basing rate applications on the future. You had to look at the historic losses, because there was a lot of anticipatory rate making. You're going to be 65 in a year. Your kid will start driving their car in a couple of years. So your rates might go up. So no forward-looking projections. Well, for those of us in the catastrophe insurance industry, that meant no catastrophe risk models, because those are basically probabilistic models that are looking at a suite of possible events, each having a very slim probability, but it's really a projection of future risk. So as catastrophe modeling came into being, the department was very conservative in interpreting this law and saying that that could not be applied for basic rate making for a homeowner's policy. They also did not allow the reinsurance costs to be included in rates, which early on was not as big of a deal, but with time, as the catastrophe portion of risk inside a policy and the rate making became bigger, it became a bigger problem for insurers. If a rate change that is proposed is more than a 7% increase, then the law requires the insurer, or even now the catastrophe risk modelers, to pay for a consumer intervener, basically to pay for Ralph Nader's organization and others to review this. So the organization actually gets paid to have people who come in and, you know, kind of an ombudsman role is basically being paid for these consumer groups. The results were that, yes, there was substantial consumer savings over time. There's some projections there, almost $7 billion US. Automobile was huge, 4 billion, 2.5 billion is what they project over a 24-year period of savings. But really it was artificially suppressing rates relative to the increasing risk as we've got into droughts and climate change and a number of other issues on wildfires. And this rate making process, because it has this consumer review, would take over a year. So you, as a company, you would be very cautious about when you would do this. You would want to do it once every few years. It's very costly. It takes a while. So rates weren't moving at the pace they needed to relative to the risk. So just a little context on California. We have 8.8 million policies. The average homeowner's policy in California in 2021 was about $1,400 US, which when you compare it to other hazard-prone states, was far less. So almost half the price of an average policy in a state of Florida with a high hurricane wind risk, or Louisiana and Texas, a third less. And during the last decade, what you're seeing on the right is what we call underwriting profit. So it's just really the profit relative to underwriting of what we call that technical premium, the actual risk embedded in that rate. And so you see, starting in the late 2015 to 2020, we had a long period of drought in California. Vegetation was drying out. We started to have a series of very catastrophic wildfires in urban areas. Also during that time, there were a ton of hurricanes and reinsurance rates went way up for everybody. And I'm sure NHC and others here in the room can attest to that. And also because insurers were canceling policies after people had experienced a wildfire, first the insurance commissioner and then the legislature set in a prohibition on cancellations, which is an important factor for anybody who's experienced a wildfire. It's an important factor to realize that people that are sort of rebuilding with the idea that they will have insurance because their policy hasn't yet been canceled, but then once they've gotten back into their home, they actually find they don't have insurance. So policy non-renewals started in around 2021 in the high fire risk areas. And in 2022, one of the major insurers said they would write no new policies in California. And that really started a cascading effect of other insurers saying the same or retreating from high risk areas or selling new policies. So we call this de-risking for an insurance company, basically looking at their portfolio and saying, where's the highest risk? Let's take that out of our underwriting guidelines. So they were retreating from our wildfire severity zones, which are mapped by our state fire agency. But they were also retreating from urban areas like San Francisco, where we have dense wood frame construction. And what was a little contradictory to this is just that many of our urban areas, our older urban areas, have done a ton of work on improving the resilience of our building stock for earthquakes, which is one of our major fire risks for a homeowner, is really post-earthquake fires. So it was a surprise for people, like myself working in this resilient space to see this happening. So some other things about the crisis. We have many states in the United States have what we call a FAIR plan. What it is a high risk pool. I don't know if you guys have this for auto. Like when I was a teenager, I got a couple of police tickets and my mom got kicked out of our standard homeowners policy. And we had to go into the high risk auto policy, and many families do when they have teenagers. So it's like that for property insurers, so the insurer of last resort, and it's basically paid for by all the insurers themselves. So they're contributing to this, but it allows them to actually put more limits on that policy. So in this case, the California FAIR Plan it has a basic fire insurance cover because that's really what the insurers don't want in their portfolios. And then a homeowner would have to go and get another policy, which we call a difference in conditions, but it's essentially a policy that covers theft or basic water leakage, other liabilities that you might have on your property. Also, the surplus lines market, which is in California, we call this the non-admitted market, but this would be like a Lloyd's of London or Chubb Insurance, people who insure high valued residential or commercial, but they don't have a standard form policy. They're writing a unique insurance policy. That market also grew. So the graph on the right is really showing you over time how these two things, the FAIR Plan and the surplus lines market, have grown as the traditional homeowners insurance market has retreated. The third outcome of this has been that consumers are doing what we're hearing this week on the news and the Consumer NZ report, and Patty Gower, is that right? I'm getting the name right? His report, people are basically buying less insurance. They may not be buying full cover that they need. They may be taking a higher deductible, or if they have no requirement to have an insurance policy, which in the United States is really if you have a mortgage, the mortgage lender will often require that you have to have an insurance policy. Or mostly does. So if you have paid off your mortgage and you own your house outright, many people are just choosing not to be insured. So we have a growing underinsured or uninsured population. Some other things that have happened that are a little bit more positive. The insurance commissioner in 2023 and early 2024 established something called the Sustainable Insurance Strategy. And these basically sort of a give and take. He's saying to the insurers, we will allow you to use CAT models for rate making. We will allow you to account for the cost of reinsurance for wildfire in your rates. But in return, you have to give value to these 10 mitigations that homeowners can take. So the catastrophe risk modelers are now figuring out actually how to price those and put those into the models. So there are things like having a Class A fireproof roof, having stronger glazing that is more fire resistant, et cetera. And then the larger insurers also have to take more of that high risk into their portfolio. So that's the kind of give and take. We'll let you use CAT models, but in return, you've got and reinsurance costs into your rates, but in return, you've got to do these other things. You got to value mitigation, which I think is really the most important thing. They then went through the process of drafting regulations, which you guys know as well. You know, we've got to go through all these things. And we have to have public comment periods and all of that. So December 2024, we're sort of just getting the whole toolkit ready. And I say that just because the fires happened 7 days into the new year. Other things that have been happening to kind of support that movement is that the insurance industry in America actually funds a nonprofit called the Institute for Building and Home Safety. They prepared a standard and a certification for the insurers to actually use to say, if this house has all of these things, then we consider it a wildfire prepared house. And that makes it a lot more obvious to the insurer if you have that certificate. So they'll come out and do the survey, prove that it's there. You as a homeowner can now shop around to insurers and say, look, I have my wildfire prepared certificate. The insurance tech sector has also just exploded with data and applications that will do risk scores. They're flying drones over our houses to see the quality of our roof and providing all of this data. So there's just a wealth of data pouring into the market at this point. The state of California also, after the big fires in 2017, 2018, really started investing a lot more money in wildfire resilience. So vegetation management. And one of the major causes of wildfires, some of the big wildfires, has actually been high winds breaking electric utility lines. So the electric utilities were unable to get insurance. So another thing we did in California that people are paying for is actually a large risk pool for the 3 electric utilities. But in return, they too have to do a bunch of mitigation. So the savings of not paying year on year for insurance has to be driven back into making their systems more resilient. So I say this to sort of say, when you think about risk in the whole, there's a lot of work going on to reduce the risk around making us a more insurable place. However, we're still facing a legacy of not doing stuff and also a fastly changing climate. So the turning point, I think, for a policy-making point of view, was really the Paradise Fire in 2018. This was just a devastating fire. It was actually caused by an electric utility company. And a small town in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains was completely wiped out. 18,000 structures. There were over 85 deaths. It was actually, here are the statistics. So you can see just an immense thing. It forced the utility to actually file for bankruptcy, which is what led to the creation of the wildfire to try to stabilize our electric utility market. But it was a small town, and I don't think it's the same number of structures that actually burned in Los Angeles, but the view of impact is so different because it was such an isolated place. And government's response to it was quite different because it was a more isolated place. So let's jump to LA. This is what, in the winter months in January, Topanga Canyon, where the Palisades fire started, would normally feel like. It's our rainy season. We would have normally had 3 or 4 months of rain, but LA was going through a pretty severe drought, even though Northern California was actually having a pretty wet year. So the vegetation looked more like this. It's called chaparral. It's very low, not a lot of trees, but also very oily vegetation. So when it catches fire, it actually can stick, the embers can stick to the vegetation. It can blow very far and has a lot of oil to burn. And there you see where the other fire broke out. That's Eaton Canyon, which is over in East LA in the Santa Monica Mountains. So these are the footprints on the urban footprint of Los Angeles. So it's a little hard to see, but basically, we've got about over half of the state's population, 25 million people living in this area. These are pretty large footprints. And that is one reason why there's, such a huge reaction to the impact. But you see a summary here of all the conditions kind of leading up to it that I described to you. On the day of this event, the National Weather Service issued a high wind warning. I got one on my phone last night here. And gives me a little anxiety. But the winds were actually For a lot of people who have lived and gone through these, what we call Santa Ana events, this felt more like a hurricane to them. The winds were extremely strong. And the ignitions have, started all over. There were many fires that actually broke out, I think 14 altogether. And there were challenges for firefighting. There were challenges for water delivery for firefighting. It was just such a drain on the system. The emergency alerting had trouble that they're still investigating. And many people died because they went to sleep and didn't know that they needed to evacuate, sadly. So here's a view from space of those two fires burning. It took nearly a month to put them out. And then the footprints of the two main fires. The other fires, while they might have had large footprints, actually were in fairly undeveloped area. So these are really the focus area of the recovery effort now. 200 people evacuated, 18,000 structures, a vast area, economic losses at over 50 billion. Some projections are even that when we look at the tail effects of this event, the losses would be as high as 250 billion US dollars. And this is just an image of Western Altadena, so the fire on the eastern side of the Los Angeles region, just to give you sort of a sense of what this looks like. So some insurance considerations, what's still happening? The insurance industry, the loss is projected to be about 30 to 50 billion. So, as Chris said, this is a small portion of the overall loss. The claims tracker that the Department of Insurance has is a little out of date. And once you're in New Zealand now, our government's not letting us get back to our government websites, which I know some of you have complained to me about, but I couldn't update this, it wasn't updated before I left. But 17 billion in claims have been paid, and that would be tracking sort of the standard stuff. So we know there's more being paid than that. And then the FAIR plan is continuing. The insurers are continuing to retreat. So we're continuing to see more policies going into the FAIR plan. They also have a huge loss in this. They were really the receivers of a lot of the cancellations in the Pacific Palisades area. So they've had to do an assessment of all the insurers who participate in the pool. So $1 billion has already been assessed because they're out of money. So this is sort of like the Natural Hazards Fund having been essentially cleaned out by the Christchurch earthquakes. The reinsurance market is expected to absorb some of this. The reports now look like it may not be as bad for them. And the insurers are now starting to work their way through that rate making, these new rules the insurance commissioner put out. But the challenge is that we're really not going to see that relief for a while. It takes a while for this whole process still to happen. The CAT modelers are having, I think Moody's RMS has just submitted their fire model for review by the insurance commissioner. And you can see that the FAIR plan has a huge concentration of risk in Southern California. So it's a very challenging condition for that organization. So some recovery considerations for insurers and the public are in our, we now have a very, sadly, experienced fire debris removal process that our federal government leads in federal declared disasters, which this was. So debris removal is actually moving at a super fast pace. They're almost completely done. It's a two-phase process. We remove hazardous waste first, and then we come back and do a cleansing of up to the first half meter of topsoil and the foundations of the houses. So when you drive through these neighborhoods now, it looks like people had like excavations of swimming pools all through there. One of the big issues for insurers is not so much the houses that didn't burn, the houses that burned, but the houses that didn't burn. And the cost of remediating the smoke and the toxic damage and toxics embedded in the house, the soil and the air is all been, a challenge for medical officials, a challenge for consistent standards. People are hearing their insurer did this, my insurer said this, it's not consistent. So the insurance commissioner is getting involved in that. There's been restricted access for residents to come back to their neighborhood for a long period of time, like the cordon in Christchurch. And there are going to be all sorts of additional costs because people are going to be required to upgrade these are old houses. They weren't built modern building code standards. So the cost of recovery is actually going to be much higher. Some of that is built into a policy, but generally I think people are going to blow through that additional buffer of what we call building code upgrade policies. Under insurance will be just because of the tariffs on supplies, demand surge, the competition for resources, all of that is actually coming into effect. The mortgage lenders are actually doing some very interesting things. In some cases, they're requiring that they be paid first so that their loan be paid off before you can start using the rest of your policy of money for recovery. So that's an automatic. If you still had, 400,000, you got to pay out of 800,000. You have 400,000 now to start your recovery. And insurers are actually selling their claims to hedge funds because they will then go and try to get reimbursed by the wildfire fund later. So this is a very interesting sort of twist and unintended consequence for policymaking. I think no one expected hedge funds would make money off of this fund that was set up. So that's a very interesting thing for us to keep watching. And as we are in America, very litigious, lawsuits are in every direction. So there's lawsuits around the insurers colluding to actually push people out of high fire areas. There's lawsuits around the smoke policies. Those are kind of the biggest ones. And then there's lawsuits against the electric utilities. So some considerations for New Zealand. Are there parallels between the historic challenges of fire risk in California and flood and other risks in New Zealand? What are the potential risks, benefits, and unintended consequences of regulatory intervention? What's the potential need, challenges for valuing mitigation? You want you to think about that. Want NAC to think about that. Are there gaps in New Zealand's hazard risk and cap modeling that needs to be filled? What potential issues are there in New Zealand regarding utility and local government liability and the rise of claims and lawsuits? And are there potential roles or needs for central government to support a sustainable private insurance market? And I want to leave you with this idea. In risk management, we talk a lot about the process of risk management. You identify risks, you assess their value, you make decisions on how you're going to handle them, and then you monitor your actions. And generally, we have sort of 4 tools that we use, buckets of tools. Insurance is only one of those buckets. We can avoid the risk, we can accept the risk, we can reduce and mitigate the risk, or we can transfer the risk. So risk transfer is one mechanism. And I think as we think about a holistic policy approach for managing risk going forward, we really need to knit up all of these other tools that we have and recognize the limits and also help strengthen each one of these tools, land use planning, building codes, and other forms of risk reduction and risk avoidance. Because risk retention and risk acceptance, I think, is still unknown to the people who are ultimately owning the risk. They don't have a good sense of what they really have in terms of risk. So more to be done there. Thank you. Okay.
Well, we'll come to the panel and the Q&A now. And first of all, can I thank you, Laurie, for your insights. I think just your take on the January LA fires shows just how complex these issues can be, both before and after a major event. Obviously you all know Laurie, but sitting next to Laurie is Emily Davies from Tower, and we've got Dr. Joe Horrocks from the Natural Hazards Commission sitting beside Emily. We have got people online who hopefully will have questions, but I was going to kick off with one question because you have arrived in an interesting week, Laurie, because our friends at Consumer New Zealand have put out their insurance report earlier this week. One of the big things that came about from that in the commentary was the need for data for consumers to understand risk. And in your presentation, you said that the insured tech sector was going gangbusters or something like that. What are you seeing there? And I'll kind of send this to both Joe and Emily as well, in terms of things that can help consumers understand what their risk is.
So first of all, I saw people taking some photographs. I just want to say that ICNZ will get my slides, and in the bottom, that little blue thing, there are references to every slide, so you can map your way back if you're interested in reading some of the reports and references for various things.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get that off there. Also, full disclosure, I worked in a catastrophe risk modeling firm for many years, so I understand this issue of data and data availability very well. And I think what you have is this tension between what I call insurtech, basically being profit driven, and the consumer and access for the consumer. And where are those, what we really have to look at is where are those ways in which those things can be met together. So I'll explain a couple. In the United States now, our real estate consolidator of information, like your Trade Me, actually now has climate risk scores attached to every property. I don't know the financials of how they work that out with the company that produces that data. A lot of what they're doing is just creating publicly available data like our state fire maps. So it's not necessarily data that isn't in the public realm already. It's just delivered now to consumers in a way that they can get access to it more quickly. And it's funny, they had for years, they had walkability scores. And I forget the other one, but the idea of risk scores came a little later. Those of us in the hazard space kept saying, well, don't you think it's more important to know your hazard score than know your walkability score? But anyway, we're there. So I think that's one example of how things have come together. You've had a data integrator give it up in a way that's very timely for a consumer that's making a risk-based decision at the time of real estate sales. We also have in California regulations that require at the time of real estate sales that the hazards be disclosed to the buyer. So that actually kind of gets built into the disclosure packet. So if you have like a home inspection and all of that stuff to look at the quality, it's I would say more overt than what a typical limb report does, in that it's more consumable. Let's just say it's right there. It's one page. There's a set format for it. Title companies that are doing the actual title transfer and the transfer of the money are now very versed in understanding they need to do this for their own liability. So those are kind of two examples of how data is more accessible. And then what we're doing, what's happening now within the broader insurance industry that I find quite interesting in California is building something called a data commons. And the concept is almost think of it as like Wikipedia, where the hope is that people will load up photographs of their own homes, that vendors will share some sort of, publicly available, maybe less high resolution data, but all of this could kind of feed into a commons that would be sort of self-monitored by the public. People could look at the data that vendors have on their home and could contest it and like load up another photograph. So it's all in the conceptualization stage. Millman actuaries are leading this with some foundation support. So some of the foundation kind of places is actually supporting it. So as I said, it's still just being conceptualized, but I'm really excited about that. I think that really would kind of level the playing field and allow still for the market to do what the market needs to do. And the consumer to actually have more information and have more control over the information about their home.
We just heard the word consumer from an insurance point of view. Carol's been pretty proactive in terms of the risk-based pricing, and Patty this week was saying, what data can consumers get their hands on, or what information can consumers get their hands on to make better decisions around buying or their insurance. But from an insurer's point of view, how important is it for making sure that consumers kind of understand the risk around their homes?
Well, our customers tell us it's really important. So we do market research. We talk to our customers all the time, and they want information about their homes, and they want information. They want to understand how we price insurance, and it's complicated. So we've got almost a billion data points going into every home in the country. So translating that into something that customers can easily understand means that that's a challenge that we set ourselves. We were the first insurer to launch risk-based pricing for earthquake risk back in 2019, and then we followed that up with flood risk back in 2021. And at that time, we knew that we had to be transparent with people about their risks to really maintain that trust and confidence in what we were doing. And we think we're globally leading on this in the way that we present those risks to customers. So if you go to the Tower website now and you go through our quote to buy process, get a quote with Tower, will give you a rating for each of the 4 perils that we that we price by risk. So that's your earthquake, your flood, your landslide, and your sea surge risk. And we'll give you a rating from very high, high, medium, low, or very low. So you can understand how that translates into your premium. That rating it's a rating of insurance risk. So we, and it tells customers how we have used it to price your insurance. So that's the purpose that we have used it for. We would love to see people have the ability to have better data and better access to information about their homes and about their risks, and that's why this conversation is just really important to have.
So the Natural Hazards Commission's got the portal where people can go and see where there's been claims, which is really useful. But what's the thinking of the next stage of that, and how can that actually help around resilience and risk reduction too, which is very important?
Absolutely. So, I mean, we talk a lot, all of us, about a shared understanding of risk, and I absolutely think it is fundamental to everything we need to do going forward, whether it's getting a clear policy mandate or understanding investment in risk reduction, you know, having that information at a homeowner level. So we're thinking about it in terms of 3 or 4 buckets. The first is improving the data quality in the first place. Excuse me, like we've still got a bit of a way to go in New Zealand on that front. Very jealous of some of the things Laurie's talking about. But it's not, you know, raw data is not enough alone. We also then need frameworks that that talk about risk, that make risk real, whether that's modelling or some of those kind of tools we've talked about. I think the third thing is we need conversations about risk and understanding risk tolerance and different worldview and perceptions on risk, understanding, you know, what the appetite is to do more. And then I think the fourth thing, possibly a little bit less talked about, is we need to institutionalize it and building that longevity for the future, because, you know, we were talking to a council yesterday that's got an 80-year adaptation plan, which is fantastic, but how do we retain that for that amount of time? So what are the ways that we can build it in? So we think, so I love the 2 things that Laurie mentioned just then. We think the portal can add to that picture if it's something that's long-standing, and we hope to iteratively improve it by adding more hazard data, getting to risk, getting to risk tolerance and risk management. But yes, I think we need lots of those things built in so that it doesn't go off the boil.
Yes. Before we go to questions on the floor, just trying to go back to the LA experience and the kind of regulatory settings there. Might be one more for you, Emily, and Laurie. It's just, I think, what can we learn from there? Obviously, there was some activity by private insurers, which meant, you know, we had large levels of people with no insurance at all. I mean, we don't want to get into that situation here in New Zealand because, you know, we've got very high levels of house cover here in New Zealand. What do we need to be mindful of in a regulatory sense to make sure that New Zealanders can continue to be protected?
It's a real cautionary tale, isn't it? I think it's so important that we have a well-functioning insurance market in New Zealand, private insurance market in New Zealand, that continues to attract, you know, the continued support of global reinsurers, because, you know, ultimately that's what we need to, you know, maintain our capital structures and continue supporting customers through large events. So that's key. I think what it's shown is that, you know, insurers need to be able to operate and make a profit and continue to offer really simple products and services to consumers. When Laurie was explaining all the different levels of cover and all the different agencies offering the different, I just got confused. And, you know, I work in insurance and I didn't understand how any of that fits together. So I don't know how consumers understand that. At Tower, we've been through a big process of simplification. We, in the past 5 years, 5 years ago, we simplified our product range from over 400 different product variations down to 14. And our preference is to offer a comprehensive home insurance policy to New Zealanders for as long as possible. And that's what we're all used to. That's what people stand, they buy a policy, they pay a premium, and they're covered for all the perils. That's what we want for New Zealand for the long term. So in order to do that, we need to continue attracting the support of global reinsurers. We need to maintain a profitable and robust industry. We need to be able to price for the risks appropriately so that we can pay the claims when a disaster strikes.
Laurie, have you got any advice for us? I think the ability for New Zealand's market to have the Natural Hazards Commission, private insurers who've got banks here today, more climate-related risk here. We know these things are going to be more frequent, and we know they're going to be more gnarly. What advice could you give to the collective here to make sure that we can reduce risk, keep people safe, make sure that there's private insurance and look at the ones that we actually can play?
Yeah, so I guess I'll throw one more cautionary tale in, which is what in California, our insurance regulators and the insurance industry are both really concerned about what happened after the Northridge earthquake in '94, which is the insurance industry pulled back. The risk was uncertain. The regulator wasn't allowing insurers to use catastrophe risk models. So something called the California Earthquake Authority was created. It is not the NHC. It is a full catastrophe policy for earthquake. And essentially that peril was taken out of the standard homeowners policy at that point. But mortgage lenders didn't require that you buy an earthquake policy. So what happened is that while we had in the epicentral area of the Northridge earthquake, about 60% of people were insured when that earthquake hit. We now have 10% of California homeowners have earthquake insurance. And so the commissioner and the market are very concerned that we don't do the same thing with fire, that we don't pull it out completely. Yes, there is the FAIR plan that's sort of setting that over to the side, but it's still, you're still able to get full coverage. And the mortgage lenders are still requiring that you have that fire coverage. So there's a concern that if we isolate the peril, that we will, actually reduce the market coverage the way we have with earthquake. And so I think that's one concern, is that to not think of this as something that you can either shed off to a separate policy. We learned that didn't work. And to also, I think, another caution is just what is society's responsibility here? I think I've also heard people saying, well, the flood should just be part of the NHC. Well, that's a huge cost to New Zealanders overall, to keep that cover for everybody and to cover the high risk areas, especially when the levy is sort of equal across the country. That means it'll be a fairly high cost, of course, to cover some of the most high risk areas borne by everybody. So without any modifications to that formula, I think there's also some moral hazard in that kind of process as well. So risk-based pricing is actually balancing risk with pricing. And I think if we can find a way to keep availability and affordability going in that context of risk-based pricing, then I guess my view is that's the healthy way to go. And we need to do what we can to help people be able to reduce their risk. So that's where a robust resilience or mitigation component and valuation of the work that people do to reduce their risk is also, I think, a key piece of the solution.
Some interesting discussions to come. We might go to the floor now. Raise of hands. I can see Jonathan, but just want to make sure I can get an idea. And Steve at the back. I might start with Steve and then come to you, Jonathan.
Chris, hi, Laurie. As far as the private insurance, if you like, for earthquake in the States, is that for building or building and land?
No, as far as I know, land damage is unique to New Zealand in the way it is done. So the CEA policy, the California Earthquake Authority policy, actually does cover a small amount of land damage, but it's under the it's basically in order to repair the foundation, but it has a cap, a sublimit on it. I don't know how this is going to stand up in a really large earthquake, I'll be honest, but that's the way that the policy is structured right now. So it's basically, if there is some sort of damage underneath the foundation, land needs to be remediated, like liquefaction damage and dewatering that particular property, then that work, there would be some amount of money available for that. But would it be, I think we would face some of the same challenges they faced in trying to do repairs after the Canberra earthquakes.
Thank you.
So look, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, Laurie. Very concerning. I mean, I can't imagine what it's like for some of the people living in California, given the multiple risks that people face and the challenges of the insurance market and the costs and so on. A quick comment and then really two questions, Laurie. You said just a moment ago that it would be very costly for the country to provide, if you like, solidaristic arrangements for flood insurance. In other words, to extend the role of the Natural Hazards Commission to include weather-related events, particularly flooding. But it's also very costly not to. I mean, the costs are going to fall. They're going to fall somewhere, regardless of what we do. So wouldn't, and this is the third question, wouldn't the sensible approach be, in the face of increasing climate-related risk, to do everything we can to reduce risk, obviously, which would include moving people out of harm's way, properties out of harm's way where the risk is beyond a certain point. So that means planned relocation, particularly in the context of sea level rise later this century. And then couple that with an extension of the Natural Hazards Commission role to climate-related risk, which is what happens in many parts of Europe. So that's my first question. And then Emily, I guess a question for you, which would be, you've now introduced risk-related pricing for multiple hazards. What I don't quite understand, and I'm a tower consumer.
Thank you. Talking to customers.
And I have to say my insurance costs here in Central Wellington have gone up threefold, from 2,000 to 6,000 in the last 3 years. And because I've got an old property, it's very difficult to get anyone else to insure it. The key point would be, how does the fact that we have a Natural Hazards Commission, which is the first loss insurer, up to 300,000 for earthquakes, how does that affect your pricing? Because my sense is it doesn't, but I may be wrong. So anyway, two different.
Well, I am not the person. I think you have put forward a proposition that should be examined. It's in terms of that risk management framework, it's a robust proposition, right? We need to have some sort of avoidance and retreat. We need to have some other sorts of resilience measures, levees, stop banks, nature-based solutions. We need to find some money for elevating houses, something that is not commonly practiced here, a little bit more common in the United States and in flood-prone areas. So certainly I'm all for a demonstration project to have people get comfortable looking at elevated houses in New Zealand. And then, you know, what would government bear? You know, a first loss program. Japan does a proportional loss, you know, which I think more countries are going to probably start thinking about. So it's a shared risk up the ladder of the loss. You know, tower is often called in the insurance world. So, you know, I think there are lots of different ways you can share, transfer, share, bear, and mitigate risk. So that you put forward one scenario, in my opinion, but I'm not the person to. I think there are many others. You know, and what combinations you do them, and in what time frame. You know, if you start now, we can do a lot to contain some of the highest risk over time until in some of our more sea level rise prone areas, you know, we won't, but that's certainly what we're doing in California now. We've started a mandated adaptation planning process along our coasts and in the San Francisco Bay, with a requirement that by 2035, all jurisdictions actually have an adaptation plan that has full implementation and financing attached to it. Our new administration is really against funding any of that kind of work. So I think this is kind of, you know, these two things have collided at the moment. And I think it's interesting because I think it's kind of opening up to the door to the conversations we're having here, which is, can adaptation actually be financed? You know, is there a way to actually make resilience, you know, an investment opportunity? And what's the way to do that?
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for being a tower customer.
Well, I don't have much choice at the moment. Serious.
So in terms of how the NHC levy and the NHC cover affects insurance pricing, I'm not a pricing expert, but there's sort of three ways. One is when the cap increase. So we collect the premiums from our customers on behalf of NHC and then flow that through. We only cover the house component, and then the NHC covers the first 400 meters. Yeah,
Oh, the 300,000.
The 300,000. We don't cover the land. So when that cap was doubled, I think, a few years ago, and we purchased slightly less reinsurance as a result of that. So that's one way it can affect pricing. The second way it affects pricing is obviously we collect that on behalf of the NHC. So any changes to that levy flows through to customers. Currently, around half of a tower insurance premium is made up of levies and taxes collected on behalf of the government. So that's almost 50%. The other way is through blunt market signals. Because that levy is applied uniformly across the country to customers, if it's increased, then the market signals we're sending about risk through risk-based pricing are told. So that's how we see it affecting pricing.
We've got some questions online, Patrick.
We have, look, one for you, Laurie. Just asking about mitigations outside of insurance, such as a building and planning changes, and what has been done in planning and development policy in California regarding wildfire risk.
Fire is a tricky one for land use. As an urban planner, I'll just say that. I think what we see is that the wind is, you have to really deconstruct what wildfire is. And I think the approach traditionally was to think of fuel loads in forested areas as the problem. And what we're seeing now is that it's fuel loads in urban areas, and that the ignitions are human caused, electrical caused, accidents. One huge fire was actually started by a guy driving a ute with a trailer behind that had a chain hanging down, and it sparked as he was going down the road, and it started a giant fire. So I think the conversation right now certainly is we need to retreat from the high hazard wildland urban interface. We shouldn't be developing more in these, these natural environments that are vulnerable. But we also we can manage the vegetation in those environments. We can actually make the home less of a fuel itself. And that's really what the problem was with the LA fires, these weren't, as you can see, these weren't forested areas. This is, I've been serving on a advisory commission for the recovery. And, I just finally said, we cannot call this wildfire. We need to get into people's heads that these were fires, and they're urban conflagrations, which is a term we've used for a long time about fire following earthquake. That you're essentially, the 1906 earthquake burned all of San Francisco. It's an urban conflagration. The fuel is the wood. And that's where I do think we have something in common here and should be thinking about too. Our older wood frame houses, if they fall off their foundations, your elevated houses can actually sever if there's piped gas or electrical lines and start ignitions. And we've been globally extremely lucky when it comes to this after earthquakes. We have not had in recent years, we've had enough firefighting capacity. Places like San Francisco have auxiliary firefighting systems. We have a whole separate water fire system to fight fires, and it's set up to be much more nimble and accessible, including siphoning water out of San Francisco Bay in case all of the piping breaks or there's some other problem with pulling water out of the pipe system. So I think fire is manageable. We have the ability to reduce the hazard and the vulnerability. And a lot of perils, earthquake, we can't stop earthquakes from happening. Like, we don't have the ability to control the hazard itself. So I actually have a lot of optimism around fire. And I think flood is somewhere in between those. Yes, we can't control rain from happening or sea level from rising, but we actually can. We have a lot of tools to intervene and mitigate, and land use is definitely one of them. But I do think both our cultures have relied a lot on building codes. And we are, I think, very forward-looking with our codes, but not necessarily looking backwards. And so we can build the most functionally recoverable, beautiful building that's all hazard-proof, but if it's sitting within an older neighborhood of really vulnerable structures, it is vulnerable too. If it's resting on top of older non-resilient infrastructure, it is not going to be a functional recovery building. Because the infrastructure won't be there to support that reoccupancy. So we have a lot of things we need to hook up. So the idea of just the phrase building in dumb places to me is quite frustrating. Oh, you said it.
I say that a lot. What's so frustrating about it then?
Well, I think it's frustrating because I think what we've done is assume, here's why it's frustrating. What we've done is assume that we can actually build proper structures. So land and avoidance, that land use, is not for a council an easy decision to make, because you've got everything stacked up over here saying, oh, well, our building code says we can build, you know, a seismically resilient building, a flood resilient building, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for councils, for land use planners, it's very hard to say we're going to stop here and avoid unless there is some sort of regulatory intervention that gives you the, you know, the cred to do that.
Good point. One more from online.
Yes, just for Emily, just asking if whether there's any appetite from private insurers to consider hazard risk reduction or mitigations actions. For example, removing hazardous chimneys, strengthening slopes, etc., that homeowners have taken when determining premiums.
We do. We absolutely do. So our models taken, I think I mentioned the billion data points. So that takes into account the footprint of the house, the elevation of the house, the camber of the land. We've mapped every home in the country. The central reference point for that property is the centre of the house, not the letterbox. So we've got some really clever data scientists and modelers who have done a lot of work to make sure that that our model reflects the individual risk characteristics of your individual home. It takes into account council level risk mitigations that we're aware of. When these are updated, we can update our models. And from an individual house perspective, if that information is not publicly available or available through our models through sources like LINS, then which gives us the build quality and the build materials, and therefore we can calculate the rebuild cost of that home. If we don't have that, and you believe that, or you've recently put some infrastructure in, or done an intervention or a risk mitigation that we're currently unaware of, you can give us a call, and it might be as simple as taking a photo and sending it to our underwriting team, and we'll take that into account in our premium that we offer you. So we do that.
Let's ask one more question, if that's all right. Look, it's actually more again for Laurie, and I think this is very relevant to New Zealand. As more information on hazard risk has been made available on homes, particularly as part of the home buying process, has there been any pushback from homeowners who perceive that the information might affect the values of their homes?
Sure there is. I'm not in all those conversations, but where I think the change is really happening is that the mortgage lenders are now engaging in this conversation. So what I'm just anecdotally hearing in my county, which is fire and flood prone, is that mortgage lenders are saying, I need a guarantee that you actually have insurance cover before I transfer this money over to the seller. So that is, I think, raising the awareness and also engaging the two parties in a conversation around that risk.
Can I step in on that as well? So, we've talked a lot about risk in the most riskiest areas. Our model shows that most of New Zealand is low risk. And so when we launch risk-based pricing for flood risks, 90% of New Zealand properties, our customers, we offered premium reduction to, and that has a portion of the premium. And then 2 weeks ago, when we launched risk-based pricing for sea surge and landslide risks, again, 90% of New Zealanders are low risk for those perils. So we offered them on average a $70 reduction in that portion of the premium. So I think we've got to be clear that most of New Zealand is low risk, and risk-based pricing is good news for most people. And then in terms of the 10% who got increases, a third of those was under $100. The majority was under $300. So we're only talking about a small proportion of the country.
It's Jonathan.
And so, you know, when we're thinking about policy responses and we're thinking about what we do as a nation to support those people, the question I have is whether a more targeted response for those communities would be more.
Okay, I'm mindful of time. I'm going to steal the last question to everyone on the panel. The motivation for ICNZ for doing these types of forums is to make sure that we're pushing along some of these discussions around risk reduction and resilience, and the regulatory settings that we need to have to make sure that we can keep communities protected and also make sure that insurance continues to be accessible in the future. I'm going to put this question to everyone on the panel. I'll start with you, Joe. What do we need to do collectively to drive action? And from an NHC perspective, because I think you have got a wealth of data, I think there's a lead role in terms of resilience messages out to the community. What do you think from an NHC perspective can be done to learn lessons from large-scale events offshore, and also the ones that we've had here, to make sure that we're as best prepared as we can, not just from a private insurance perspective, but also from a public policy perspective, and making sure that we can keep communities safe?
It's a small question.
Yeah.
I think we've got the opportunity in New Zealand to set up our system right, and it needs to be a system, a holistic response, not any one lever or any one agency. I particularly think we need to almost think about affordability as one issue, but the broader adaptation as the wider prize. I read a great quote the other day, which was affordability without risk reduction is like a sugar hit. It feels good in the short term, but you're heading for a big fall. So yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about a shared understanding of risk that needs to underpin everything to get that kind of agreement of the way forward. I think I would like to see a big push for a clear policy mandate, like something that aligns the policy agendas that every portfolio can get behind, whether it's resource management, emergency management, finance, all of the others. And then I think it's follow the money, attach maybe conditional funding is the right way to put it. That if we're offering insurance or offering funding for infrastructure or whatever, some condition, risk reduction, objective and condition attached to it. That way that we start to build that system that everything's filtering down, if you like, starting with data, a clear mandate that everybody can get behind, policy and funding alignment. Not simple, but you know, build the system up rather than trying to go for some shiny quick win.
From an insurance perspective,
We need a clear national adaptation framework. We need a plan, and we need it urgently, and it needs to include local communities. And where people need information, they need data, and they need information that they can understand easily about their homes. It's a whole system in New Zealand that encourages people to buy homes in risky areas. You've got councils consenting, you've got developers making money, you've got insurers, and then you've got banks lending. There's a whole system there that needs to be able to send those risk signals to people so that they can make good decisions. We need adaptation planning and data.
Yeah. Laurie, last piece of advice for New Zealand?
Be strategic, take a longer view, don't be reactive, because I think so much of the way we try to fix our problems and policymakers fix our problems is when, you know, who's screaming loudest. So right now we're reacting to fire, we're ignoring flood. Flood is not well insured in America. We have a national flood insurance program that is, some say, broken and maybe undermined. abolished with this administration. So, you know, there's just, I think having a holistic view, taking a longer view, looking at how all the tools fit together and looking at the conflicts in policy for people on the ground who are trying to actually work with the regulatory environment. I'll just throw one out that I know we share, which is both our countries have such pressure to build housing. We have such pressure to mitigate our hazards. Those things are not aligned right now. And it is more expensive to do infill development, brownfield development, than it is to do greenfield development. So it's a lot easier to go and build in a new dumb place, especially if somebody tells you that I can build it, you know, to meet the resilience needs of today. Well, the resilience needs of today are not the resilience needs of tomorrow when it comes to climate. We know that it will change. So we need to help those people who are on the ground, the first line, having to make that policy decision, our elected officials in local government and our staff in local government. So I'm a local government person, and I hope that you know, I think California and New Zealand were roughly the same size. We have all the same problems. You know, I would love to see us doing more together to try to solve these conundrums of policy.
I've broken my promise to keep this to an hour. I think we could keep going for a lot longer, but I'll just do a quick wrap up and thank Laurie, Emily and Joe for their wisdom and expertise on the panel this morning. Laurie, thank you for coming to visit New Zealand and sharing your wisdom with us as well. It's been a very useful opportunity for us to be able to use that as a catalyst for the discussion that we'll have today and continue to have. On behalf of the ICNZ, can I thank Tonkin and Taylor for co-hosting this event today. To John and James, thank you very much, and also to our ICNZ team who have put in a lot of work to make sure that we can all be here this morning. There is a lot of food. My Catholic guilt. I'd like you all to make sure if you would like to eat and take some with you to save yourself some lunch money today, please help yourself. But again, to everyone who's come here today and online, thank you very much. It won't be the last discussion we have on this topic. So please make sure you stick around to have a cup of coffee and enjoy some of the breakfast / morning tea, and have a lovely safe weekend, and thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.